Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're listening today. Hello, my name is Kim Sager, and I am the VP of Communications and Marketing for MPMA. Today is our second webinar for Fleet Management Awareness Month, so thank you for joining us. Before we get started and I introduce our speaker, I would like to run through some of the logistics. This webinar today is recorded, and we will post on our MPMA website and YouTube channel later this month. If you're registered and logged in today, you will automatically receive CEU credit. And then lastly, if you have any questions during the presentation, please write them in the question box, and we will review them as we go or at the end, depending on the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Ryan Daly. Ryan is a senior manager at Mercury Associates, where he is primarily responsible for managing federal clients and contracts. He has more than 10 years of experience in fleet management consulting in both private and public sector. His past experiences include working directly with federal agencies as the Federal Fleet Projects Manager at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, supporting the U.S. Department of Energy. Ryan also spent time with an EV leasing company, Vision Fleet, before supporting the Electrification Coalition's efforts to electrify municipal fleets around the country. Prior to joining Mercury, he served as CEO of Denver-based Swatch Labs, where he spearheaded the creation of an industry-leading decision support platform while leading business development and customer success. Ryan has specific expertise in fleet sustainability, especially efforts to implement alternative fuels, with a particular focus on electric vehicles in recent years. He is also an expert in the use of telematics data to help fleets better manage their assets and inform procurement decisions to ensure fleets have the right type of vehicles as well as the right number of assets to meet operational needs. Ryan holds a BA in Geography from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and a Master's in Geography and Political Science from UCLA. Ryan, please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you to everybody who's attending today. A topic that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts right now is what is happening as a result of the pandemic in all of our lives. And so for this presentation today, I'd like to talk a bit about what we're seeing in the fleet world since the onset of COVID last year. So with that, I will jump right in here to see if I can advance my slides. So looking a little bit into the crystal ball, thinking about what we've seen over the course of the past year. The arrival of COVID coincided with a number of different things that are going on in the economy that are having a pretty significant impact on fleet management. So first and foremost, we saw the end of a 10-year economic expansion, which lasted about 129 months, which was the longest on record. But it was also, interestingly, the weakest of the 12 expansions since World War II, where an annual average increase in employment was just 1.1% compared to 3.1% for the previous 12 expansions, and also an increase in GDP of just 2.3%, which is compared to 4.3% in previous expansions. So while it lasted a long time, it wasn't quite as significant as some of the economic expansions that we had seen previously. Also, as we all know, unemployment kind of skyrocketed, certainly in the early days of the pandemic, when we got up to around 15% in April of last year. And that was the highest that we had really experienced since the Great Depression. Things look like they've stabilized a bit over the course of the rest of the year, and I think we're currently around 7%, which is pretty good news, but not quite where we were at pre-COVID levels when unemployment was about 4%. And I still think that it's safe to say that a lot of industries and many people remain underemployed right now as their jobs have been impacted by the pandemic. As we all know, the nature of our professional lives has also changed in really drastic ways. Our workplaces look very different than they did at this time last year, as many people are now consistently, if not entirely, working from home or remote locations. And certainly the frequency of our face-to-face interactions with colleagues and clients and customers has been greatly diminished. And really right now, there does not appear to be much of an end in sight to that change. In addition to that, we remain in the middle of some changes to the composition of our workforces that seem like they may only be exacerbated by the pandemic, particularly in fleet management, where a lot of institutional knowledge resides in baby boomers who are rapidly approaching the end of their careers, and a younger influx of millennials and Generation Y employees who tend to change jobs much more frequently than a lot of their older peers did. So all of these changes and all of this uncertainty from our perspective at Mercury Associates creates a kind of perfect storm that the fleet management profession will need to weather in the coming years. So what are we looking at in this storm? As we've just mentioned, and I'll expand on in a little bit in the next slide, significant changes in how we work combined with the composition and experience of our workforce have changed things tremendously. Added to that are the continued impact of advancements in both automotive and information technology. And for fleets, especially the feds, which is kind of my core area of expertise, this entails a couple of pretty critical realities. First and foremost, feds, and to a slightly lesser extent, state and utility fleets have been tasked with the adoption and implementation of alternative fuel vehicles for decades. In recent years, the major focus of this has shifted to vehicle electrification, so electric vehicles, and other fleet greening and efficiency efforts like right sizing, vehicle allocation methodologies, consolidations to more leased assets, etc. However, as the enthusiasm for electrification has ebbed and flowed, many fleets have missed or neglected the opportunity to leverage that enthusiasm to obtain support for other investments in fleets, such as infrastructure upgrades, employee training, etc. And second, many of the fleets that we work with have invested in new information technology, such as fleet management information systems, telematics, maybe network charging stations. And for the feds, the decision to integrate these technologies has been made for them in some places. So particularly agencies that are leasing from GSA, they are now starting to roll out telematics standard in all their new leased vehicles, which is kind of to say, like it or not, some pretty significant technological changes and challenges are coming fast. And to make things a little bit more difficult, a lot of fleet organizations have not invested nearly enough in the employee skills needed to enable a modern data-driven business practices. And just to make things even more interesting, I'm sure that everybody has noticed that we're in the middle of a transition to a new presidential administration. With an incoming Biden-Harris administration, we are fully expecting changes to the regulatory environment that impacts fleets. At a pretty basic level, we're expecting that an executive order on environmental stewardship in the federal government will come pretty quickly, perhaps in the first 100 days. And, kind of leaning on what we learned during the Obama administration, we expect that this will likely place new regulations on federal fleets and is likely to emphasize electric vehicles. At maybe a slightly more interesting level, fleet managers across federal, state government, and the utility sector in particular should be watching for changes to the Energy Policy Act. This was last updated in 2005, but with a power switch in Congress, it may get an update fairly soon. And this would certainly impact existing alternative fuel vehicle acquisition requirements in the state, federal, and utility fleets. And those regulations could go even further, perhaps requiring greater alternative fuel use, for example. And so the question kind of looms, are you and is your organization and fleet management team ready to weather this storm? So a little bit more on changes to our professional environments. So Workforces in several industries that rely heavily on vehicles and equipment are aging, with significant portions of their employees being 55 years and older. This includes the utility, trucking, transit, and government industries. According to OMB, average age of the federal workforce is older than the nation's broader workforce, with about 29% of those employees older than 55. On the other end of the spectrum, only about 7.3% of the federal workforce is under 30 years old, compared to 23% in the private sector. And I think it's fair to also state that the composition of fleet management teams reflects these demographics and may even skew a little bit further on the side of older employees. And the reason that I bring this up is simply to acknowledge that there's a looming brain drain in fleet management. I was on a conference call at the end of summer with a group of federal fleet managers who were chiming in with the lengths of their tenure with their respective organizations. And it was very common to hear things like 20 years, 30 years, or more. And really, that's just a lot of organizational and institutional knowledge in the portion of employees that are nearing retirement. And then we add to that increasing technological complexity of vehicles and equipment and associated technology that goes with them. And it really points to some growing pressure on fleet management, especially in the maintenance and repair side of the job, where just significant changes to what those folks do and how much they'll be expected to work on vehicles as we start to see more vehicles that have less moving parts, don't require oil changes, so on and so forth. And then, you know, if things were not already challenging enough, now we add COVID and the pandemic to the pot. In some instances, we've started to see decreased vehicle use because of reductions in face-to-face meetings, increased work from home. We've also seen organizations incur additional operating costs to ensure that vehicles and facilities are properly sanitized or to accommodate social distancing guidelines. Two examples that I've heard of in the past week are policies that require only one employee per vehicle, as well as the installation of plastic barriers to separate drivers and passengers. And, you know, so on the one hand, we thought that the biggest impact of the pandemic might be a reduction in vehicle use. We're now actually starting to see some things that might actually drive up individual vehicle use. If you go from 2 or 3 folks that might have driven in a vehicle together to now each of those individuals driving a single vehicle, that could actually start to have the opposite effect and increase vehicle use. So a couple of the other potential impacts that we're seeing, particularly on the feds, but that we have seen in other fleets, include an increased interest in using personally owned vehicles for business travel, some reduced enthusiasm for funding of fleet electrification, some reduced appetite for investments in and the recurring monthly charges for decision support tools like telematics or analytics software, and yet at the same time increased pressure to use those decision support tools to identify fleet cost savings. So a little bit of a mixed bag, kind of a double-edged sword in some of the things that we're seeing. So real quick, I want to talk about kind of the modern automotive landscape and some of the trends that we had been seeing in that industry pre-COVID, and that have been challenging fleets in the recent years. So autonomous vehicles, autonomy is probably the hottest topic among these changes in the recent past. And I think, well, you know, kind of the direct impact of this technology on a fleet's current day-to-day is pretty minimal. The technology is going to have a tremendous impact in years to come. You know, I think in the near term, what we might begin to see is some reductions in accidents and associated repair costs, alongside improved driver safety as some of the first automated technologies arrive. And in the longer term, it's certainly worth starting to think about how removing drivers from a vehicle entirely would impact a workforce. in a more immediate sense, connected vehicles and the use of technology like telematics and dash cams are now as much the rule as they are an exception. And so, for any of you that have that technology, or any of you that are acquiring new GSA leased vehicles this year, connected vehicle technology is on its way. And so the question becomes, are you in a position to consume and analyze and then make decisions with a really voluminous new data stream? And are you going to be able to integrate these new data with your legacy fleet management systems? I think both of those are really critical questions to ask right now. Next two bullets related to shared transportation and mobility as a service had been really hot topics over the past 5 to 6 years. And in my opinion, are probably the most impacted by the pandemic. All of a sudden it became commonplace for us to order a vehicle on our phones, jump into a car with a complete stranger, and rush off to wherever we were going. And now the idea of kind of sharing anything physical with someone you don't know seems totally terrifying. Of course, I don't expect these concepts to disappear, but I do suspect that their impact on fleets is probably diminished in the near term. And then lastly, infrastructure. On the one hand, physical infrastructure upgrades are going to be really critical, especially supporting things like electrification and the installation of charging stations, which I think is going to require a level of coordination between fleet and facilities and procurement that may have been less prevalent in the past. And on the other hand, establishing, using, and maintaining some of the technological infrastructure to support and manage the adoption of new vehicle and information technologies will also be critical. So I want to focus a little bit more on information technology and some of what we're seeing in this aspect of fleet management. So first are telematics, which for those that are not familiar, is a technology to track and use the movement of your vehicles. This can be a really invaluable tool to monitor vehicle use and performance, driver safety, utilization, develop predictive maintenance schedules. But what it also means is that each vehicle is likely going to generate thousands of data points each day. Similarly, the addition of network charging stations to a fleet's fuel management program adds kind of another layer of complexity, an additional data stream and cost center that needs to be managed alongside bulk fueling locations at your own facilities, fuel card use at retail stations. Kind of on a more positive note, these network stations can be really valuable in helping, particularly in the federal space where they're required to ensure that they're accurately tracking and reporting electric use in those vehicles. Additionally, many of you may be using off-the-shelf fleet management information systems to manage your inventories, costs, drivers, dispatch, maintenance records, etc. And I think perhaps the most common challenge that we are encountering in talking to fleet managers across different industries is how they're going to integrate these new technologies and data streams with these legacy systems. From a really basic sense, it could be as easy as enabling kind of an integration between two providers. At a slightly deeper level in order to ensure that all of your systems can talk to each other, or maybe more importantly, so that you don't have to log into 3 or 4 different systems online every time you need to answer a question. Thinking about data management and systems integration is an important planning step to undertake right now, if you haven't done so already. So what this likely means is that there's also an additional investment in what I kind of jokingly termed technology to use technology. And this could be as simple as such tools like consolidated databases that are in the cloud, so that you can easily access your data, or adding business intelligence platforms so that you can analyze and visualize your data. One important thing to note for the feds in this space is that GSA is kind of going through something like this right now, a whole systems modernization, updating their legacy systems that might be 10, 15, 20 years old, and moving to a much more modern system. I think that's going to drastically improve the customer experience there. But just to give you a sense of a large fleet organization that is going through something like this, because it's really critical as you start to add these new layers of technology and data. And of course, collecting data in and of itself does not yield results. And that's why I think it's also very critical to make appropriate investments in employee training so that your organization can actually take advantage of these technologies and not get bogged down by them. This could be training in things like database administration, analytics, and maybe in some best case scenarios, software engineers. Really at the end of the day, what we're hoping fleets are able to do with this technology is build, a truly data-driven management practices and not become totally overwhelmed with the technology itself. So I want to talk a little bit more about connected fleet, connected vehicles, and talk a little bit about how we're using some of these data streams to look for trends and operational needs within a fleet. So as we've discussed already, we've got telematics and vehicle GPS. Most often, this is a add-on device that is connected to the vehicle and then is communicating data up through the cellular network to a cloud database. You can get really detailed information on engine diagnostics, fuel use, vehicle efficiency. You can monitor the idling of individual assets. I think one of the more common and important uses is managing safety, looking for incidences of speeding, harsh braking, setting up accident alerts, or having accident recreation can really help improve driver safety across a fleet. And then, of course, we've got vehicle location that comes with that. So getting a really detailed picture of what a vehicle is doing in terms of the routes that it drives, the times of day that it does it, how frequently it does it, so on and so forth. And that's kind of the newer data set that's coming in to go alongside some legacy systems like a traditional fuel management system. Most fleets will issue fuel cards or key fobs to allow them to fuel on-site or off-site at retail stations. So we've got a long history of having fuel transaction records for the fleet to give a picture of use on one side to understand how much fuel is being used, what the overall energy consumptions and costs are. You add to that the layer of telematics and GPS, and you start to get a really complete picture of what each individual vehicle is doing. And then, of course, in addition to that is maintenance and repair shop records, work order management, understanding time to completion for different jobs, how much downtime your vehicles have. These are two of the more traditional fleet data sets that would go into a fleet management information system. And then adding to that this layer of telematics is really where things start to get interesting. And then one thing I wanted to throw in here, just because I think it's kind of cool, is we were introduced to a company that is now developing smart tires. So if you weren't already getting enough data on your vehicles, you can now have sensors put into each individual tire that's going to monitor tread depth, air pressure, tire pressure, and kind of overall tire health, and generating one data point per tire every time it rolls over. So, an interesting and new data set that's going to come into fleet management and add to what we're already seeing in these volumes in other places. So real quick, kind of talk a lot about data management and monitoring or modernizing the fleet and using these data sets to improve operations. And I think having a sense of how you can use analytics to do that can really help improve the understanding of how a fleet is operated, how it's managed, and what the costs are associated with that. I think sometimes the idea of developing analytics can be a little bit scary, and so I want to assure people that it's not a four-letter word. I want to walk through a couple of examples really quick to show some ways to kind of keep it simple, especially at the beginning of the process where you're starting to look for higher level trends in the fleet. Then focusing on establishing some key performance indicators, something to give you a sense of where you'd like your fleet to be, so that as you move through the process of incorporating these technologies, you can monitor your progress and see whether or not you are falling short in some areas, overachieving in other areas, but otherwise to give you a sense of where you stand relative to these KPIs, so that you can seek improvements in the future and then refine your analytics going forward from that. So really kind of a basic start to this. We're doing some mileage comparisons for one of our federal fleets, and I think there's a couple of interesting things that come out of this fairly simple chart. It's fiscal year 19 compared to fiscal year 20 for the feds, and the first thing that jumped out to me is that it looks like on the whole these vehicles are being driven quite a bit less than in the previous year, where at least some of the top vehicles were approaching something more like 10,000 miles. They had none that were achieving that in the current year. But then within this is also, there's certainly some vehicles that are driving quite a bit more than they experienced in the previous year. And the third piece of this is that, there's just not a lot of consistency. I mean, I think in a lot of places we would hope from a managerial standpoint that we're going to see some relative consistency year to year in what a vehicle does, how much it operates, and therefore how much it costs, and how much effort we need to put into maintaining it. And I think the reason that this is interesting here is because one of the more traditional ways to track mileage has been through the use of fuel cards at fuel pumps and retail fuel stations, where an operator is tasked with entering the odometer number at the pump. And unfortunately, what this does is it enters a significant amount of human error into the data that we get on mileage, if that's our only source of that information. It would be fairly common for us to see people enter, 5 or 6 digits of the same number, to see numbers go backwards. So we would see negative mileage between fuel purchases. And it made it kind of a notoriously unreliable source of real mileage data. And the difficulty with this is that, one, it puts an onus on the employees to do that and be accurate. And two, it just gives a very cloudy picture of vehicle utilization, if that's all we have to make that determination. So moving on from there, I wanted to present a couple of examples that show, a fairly high level picture of how we were then kind of moving from that first example into a more detailed data set using telematics, where we have really detailed trip data that allows us to aggregate at the beginning and then slice and dice that data as we identify things that we're interested in looking at. So what we have here are SUVs that were in use over a 12-month period by one of the fleets that we've been working with. And we're looking at things in terms of total mileage at a weekly level. And the first thing that we can see is that it fluctuates pretty consistently week over week. We've got some vehicles that are driving a whole lot more than other vehicles. And the next thing that popped out was that for this particular subset, we really did see a drastic drop off in vehicle use during kind of the initial 8-week quarantine period that started in March of last year. Now, this is kind of what we expected in a lot of instances, and I want to show an example after this that shows kind of the opposite picture. But the other thing that I like to highlight in this example is one of the other things that we can start to identify, even at this very high level picture using this more detailed data set, is the number of vehicles that were actually in operation in any one of those particular weeks. So the maximum number of vehicles that we ever saw drive in a particular week is 30, but on average was closer to 20. And in this organization overall, there's actually 48 total SUVs. So that means in a typical week, there's between 18 to 30 vehicles that are not in operation. And what this allows us to do is start to identify some things that are happening within the fleet so that we can start to then look down at sub-organizations within this fleet that are assigned different pools of vehicles, and even down to individual vehicles to understand when they're being used, how often, so on and so forth. Okay, moving on to this next example. We're looking at half-ton pickups. So same graph that we had on the previous example, looking at things on a weekly basis. We can see what we would expect around the holidays, so a big reduction around Thanksgiving and then Christmas and New Year. But then we really did not see the same drop off in vehicle use when the quarantine started last year. And I mean, this was something that we kind of suspected, but it's really nice to have this data to show back to a different organization that says, you know, all this change going on in the world, all these changes to our workforce, but there are very much subsets of the fleet whose operational needs have not really been impacted at all. Over the course of the data that we have here, things look pretty consistent for this subset of vehicles. And there were actually about 116 total pickups in this particular pool, and they're operating pretty consistently at the same levels post-COVID as they were pre-COVID. Same thing in this data set where we've got a sense of how many of those vehicles are in operation on average, so about 76 versus a maximum of 87. So still interesting to see how many vehicles may be sitting idle in a given week, but certainly a very different picture than we saw from the SUVs within this same fleet overall. And then the last thing I want to reflect on in kind of an analytical sense, and as fleets might be considering the different technologies and data providers that are available to them, is that methodology matters. And the reason that I bring this up is because different data providers often have different methodologies for calculating what on the surface might look like the same thing. So I wanted to show this example. We had a client that was using their telematics data to charge for vehicle use based on how many hours a vehicle was used in a particular day. But what we found is that the kind of base utilization calculation that was coming out of this technology provider was counting use of any duration in a particular hour, and it would count the entire hour. So that meant if you had a trip that was maybe only 10 minutes, but it crossed from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., it counted that as 2 hours of utilization. And when we broke that down to a slightly or to a more granular level to look at the actual individual trips and how long they were taking, it appeared, at least on the surface, that there was the possibility they might be overcharging their users for those vehicles. And so, really the point of this is to just say, as you start to bring in these new technologies, it makes sense to take the time up front to understand the differences in how things are calculated before you really start using their data. It's certainly not to say that those differences or any one methodology is right or wrong or better or worse. It's just to make sure that you understand that the way they've calculated it may not be exactly what you're looking for. So just kind of a cautionary tale to be on the lookout for this as you start to incorporate new data sets. Okay, really quickly, to wrap up kind of the analytical piece of this, I mentioned this earlier on, and that's the concept of a vehicle allocation methodology, something that is primarily coming out of requirements for the feds, but it's something that we've used across all different industries. And the idea is really to get an organization to think about the methodology that they use to assign vehicles within the organization. So at the very beginning of the process, what we do is assess the size and composition of a fleet as is, and as it's been operating over the last 12 months, for example. And then we move into a process where we survey fleet users to understand vehicle assignments, take that data and compare objective vehicle use information alongside what we get in terms of the subjective input from users. And that allows us to evaluate each individual asset, kind of determine its role within the fleet, and then eventually move into recommendations for retention and elimination. And what this allows us to do is kind of take a snapshot of the fleet and work towards establishing an optimal fleet size and composition for that organization to achieve over time. In the federal space, this is actually something that is required every 5 years, or if mission needs and operations change, they then turn these into fleet management plans and optimal fleet profiles, which are part of their reporting requirements. This is probably among the most common things that we do for federal organizations, but again, it's something that we have used outside the federal space with fleets in all sorts of different sectors, public and private. So, what does this mean for the federal fleets in particular, and I think more broadly for non-federal folks that are in the audience? I think ideally, fleet owners would be spending time thinking about the implications of all these challenges and developing plans to meet them. And I think that this requires a degree of kind of strategic focus that is difficult to achieve even in normal times, let alone in a pandemic, a recession, and changes in leadership all happening concurrently. It also means that the responsibility for the operation and management of increasingly sophisticated fleets is being entrusted to a really rapidly evolving workforce, which may or may not be kind of well set up to weather the perfect storm. And I think in addition to that, a lot of decision makers are maybe disinclined to think much beyond the next fiscal year or two, and they may make a lot of short-term decisions that could potentially exacerbate these long-term challenges. And so our hope that would be by illuminating some of these issues, we can help fleets think about getting their head wrapped around their long-term needs and pushing for these with decision makers who may be more focused on the near term, which can be certainly a common problem, especially in the public sector. And relative to operation and maintenance of complex fleet assets and new technology, I think there's a couple of items to keep in mind. First, really critical to understand the role that information technology is going to have in driving improvements in your business processes. Second, understanding what are your current capabilities to consume, store, and then actually use data available from that technology, and then making sure that you seek the right resources to get where you want to go. Lastly, I think it's also important to understand the challenges your fleet's going to face in trying to improve efficiency in those business processes and reduce costs through things like electrification, right sizing, leasing versus owning, and then making sure that you have capable decision support tools can be really valuable in this process to understand where these tactics can and perhaps cannot actually improve your fleet operations. Okay, so change in administration. This is upon us. The White House is turning over tomorrow, and I think for any of the feds in our audience, certainly wondering what to expect in the coming months and years, but certainly of relevance to other fleet professionals out there as well. So based on what we know about who is headed into office, as we talked about earlier, it seems very likely that we'll expect a renewed and pretty significant focus on sustainability and environmental initiatives. I think whether or not we see congressional action that targets fleets is a bit more uncertain. But again, with a change in the leadership in Congress, it certainly appears likely. So with all this in mind, there was just kind of an interesting observation that I found in just the composition of the federal fleet after the last economic downturn. And what we saw early in the Obama administration was a pretty significant impact of stimulus money, which left a number of organizations fairly flush with cash, and that meant that the inventory spiked to around 660,000 vehicles in 2010, which was 2 years after the stimulus package. And then there was a really significant push to reduce costs and reduce the size of certain portions of the federal fleet, which led to a drop of about 25,000 down to 635,000 in 2014. Since then, the inventory has crept back up pretty slowly over the last few years, and in 2019 was at levels that were pretty consistent with what we saw in 2007. Oddly, the fleet kind of looks very similar to what it did right before the last recession and the last stimulus package. So something to keep an eye out for here, and I'll talk about this more on the next slide. Just a quick note, though, to ignore that giant spike in 2016. There was a major change in the reporting methodology for the feds, and we think there's some major reporting areas. So it looks like a big spike and another dip, but that line should be a little bit more smoothed out. So, okay, kind of wrapping things up. Where are we going with all this? What does this mean for fleet managers in the near term? I certainly think that if we do see some sort of stimulus money in the near term, we might expect another spike in budgets and possibly fleet inventories. But again, I think that would probably be followed by some fairly steep cuts after that. So I think the concept is to get ahead of that, to make sure you have a good sense of what your actual fleet needs are, and perhaps what you do in the case of a bump in funding, and then following that a potential sharp decline in funding. Hopefully we can all learn a little bit from the craziness that followed the last recession. And I think part of this is asking whether or not an increase in funding necessarily needs to be spent on more vehicles, or if additional funding could be better suited for things like infrastructure upgrades, whether that could be physical infrastructure like EV charging stations, or digital in terms of employee training, and technology to use technology. Similarly, when budget cuts are looming, also good to have a sense as to where things like fleet right sizing or downsizing actually can save money or might not. It might look really good in the near term, but some of that downsizing may end up driving costs up in the long term if there's not a careful look at which assets are removed or downsized within the fleet. And then just as a closing thought for fleets looking at the post-COVID world, where we're still in a recession, dealing with a lot of uncertainty, or at least coming out of a recession. A couple overarching takeaways that I wanted to leave everybody with. First, figure out where you can improve efficiency and reduce costs through business process improvements. Just because it's always been done one way doesn't mean it should necessarily continue to be done that way. Second is coming back to technology, and that's understanding that new technology is coming, new data streams are coming, and understanding how your organization needs to figure out what role that technology will play in driving some of the improvements that you seek. And then certainly at the end, last but not least, is employee training and succession planning. I think this is going to be really critical for a lot of organizations who have a number of folks that might be nearer to the retirement age than the other side of their careers, and just making sure that the fleet management team is ready to transition and weather this perfect storm. So with that, I will conclude my piece and then open it up for questions with the rest of our time.
Thanks, Ryan, so much for speaking today, and lots of great information. If anybody has a question, I don't see any right now in the question box, but please go ahead and put in your questions if you have any. While we wait a minute to see if any come in, I will go ahead and give a little plug for our third and final webinar, which is actually scheduled for Thursday, January 28th. And it is also at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Connie Aaron from GSA is going to be presenting on federal fleet policies, regulations, and data. So if you're interested in that webinar and you haven't registered yet, you can still do that on our MPMA website under the Fleet Management Awareness Month page. Also on that page, you will find our Fleet Word Search contest. If you haven't done that yet, it's a fun way to do a quick word search and submit it. And then you can be put in for a we're going to pick 10 random winners for some Amazon gift cards at the end of the month. Also on our social media, if you're on Facebook or LinkedIn, we are posting fleet tips and information, so check that out as well. All right, Ryan, I don't see anybody posting any questions in the box. It looks like you've covered all their questions in your presentation, maybe. But I will offer, if you're okay, if they have questions after the presentation's over, that they can use your information on the screen to either call or email you directly if they have any questions. Can I throw that out as an
absolutely.
option?
Yep, not a problem at all. So yeah, folks, feel free to reach out whenever.
Okay, sounds great. Well, I guess we will wrap things up then. Again, I appreciate everybody who attended today. And Ryan, thanks again so much for speaking.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.